everyone. Welcome to another installment of the Historical Society of the New York Courts podcast series, chatting with the authors of Judicial Notice. We released the latest issue of Judicial Notice late last year, and we're revisiting some of the pieces with the authors of them. I'm Eric Vandervoort, the Society's Communications Fellow, and today I'm speaking with the Honorable Richard Dollinger of Rochester area. Judge Dollinger was a retired member of the New York Court of Claims and an acting Supreme Court justice in the Rochester area, retired a few years ago. Before that, he had a long and distinguished career in public service, including as a state senator and as an attorney for a number of years. Judge Dollinger, thank you so much for joining us.
Eric, thank you very much for having me.
I'm glad to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to talk about these things that I wrote about, and I'm ready to go when you are.
Great. So as most of our listeners know, Judicial Notice is the Society's signature publication, and we feature all topics of history, New York's legal history and life. And you wrote one of the longer pieces in this year's issue, and it was a really interesting conversation, or a really interesting topic. So I'd like you first for our readers who may not have had a chance to read the piece yet, and we definitely encourage everyone to do so. You can go to history.nycourts.gov to get to that. Could you set the scene for them, sort of the era that we're in? Because we bounce across a lot of different eras.
Sure. Before I do that, let me just give a couple quick thanks. I want to thank Allison Morey, who was in charge of this whole project and big help. I can't forget Helen Freeman, who was my mentor in helping make this happen, and Daniel Goodwin as well, who was my principal editor. When you write a piece like this, those people become indispensable. They force you to rethink things. They demand that you're accurate and you've done the job as a writer. So I wanted to give them a thank you right up front. This article is really about taking people back 125 years. And we go back to the world of New York State, Western New York politics and change in the period from the post-Civil War at the middle of the 1860s up until really the 1920s. And it's a 60-year period that is filled with all kinds of change. America explodes in this period of time. The economy grows at a rapid pace. Change occurs. Industrialization occurs. The Industrial Revolution really comes to America, and it especially comes to Rochester and Buffalo. And with it comes a new politics. The old patrician politics of white males and landowners making all decisions. In the post-Civil War period, there's a whole new band of voters that come into the cities seeking jobs. And they come to Buffalo and they come to Rochester. And that's really what this is about, the growth of Western New York. The canals had been built in the early part of the 19th century, which drove commerce through both of these cities. But the explosion in population, the new immigrants, and Emma Goldman, one of the principal characters, fits in the immigrant profile. And then the more patrician establishment is personified in the principal character of John Hazel, who eventually becomes the first federal district court judge in the Western District of New York. But it's really a story in which these two characters play a role in the tumult and change that accompanies a rapidly growing America. And it brings into play the politics, it brings into play the industrialization, the consequences of industrialization to large numbers of workers before the age of unions or minimum wage, when children and child labor could be exploited. All of these things play a role, and it's really following the lives of this Russian immigrant woman and this Buffalo patrician as they navigate their way to a collision. And it's the story about how their lives came together on two unusual circumstances that brought these two very, very different people, one from Rochester, one from Buffalo, together.
And before we get into the cast of characters here, and we'll tell the listener a little more about John Hazel and Emma Goldman in a moment, but one of the things that struck me is that, I live in upstate, and you do, I think you do currently still as well. But
Yes.
it's a very different world between then and now because we're in a sort of post-industrial or Rust Belt kind of state now, and that's what people think of when they think about upstate. But I didn't even realize until I read this piece that at one point Buffalo was in the top 10 largest cities in the country. So
Correct.
can you tell us a little bit about what does on the ground look like, that moment, that sort of late, that sort of era look like just on the ground, and what changes were happening in concrete terms?
Well, there's a fascinating industrial side of this, and then there's a political side of it. Because let's just talk about the politics for a second. In the wake of the American Civil War, the Republican Party really ran everything. The Southern Democrats, the old Jacksonian Democrats, had gone into hiding in the wake of the Civil War. And really the Republican Party, what eventually became the Whig Party, really ran politics in the period just before the Civil War and just after it. As you may know, there were only 2 Democratic presidents elected in the 60 years after the American Civil War. Grover Cleveland, who came from Buffalo, and Woodrow Wilson, who was from Virginia. So what's fascinating is the urbanization of politics occurs. Large numbers of immigrants flood into the cities. Irish, Polish, French, Italians move into the cities. The politicians are eager to get them enrolled in the voting so that they can cast ballots. And there's a big wave of electoral participation. So the politics begins to change. And during this period of time, in the period from the post-Civil War, with the exception of Cleveland, who became both governor and mayor of Buffalo, the Republican Party really had the upper hand throughout the latter part of the 19th century. John Hazel, one of the characters that I write about, is an epitome of that political machine. But the other thing I think that's important, and you really touch on it here, is this is the birth of the American century. The period of time in which these characters are playing out their lives is a time of incredible growth. The canal had opened up Buffalo to become one of the principal ports in the United States. I mean, you think about it today and you would say, gee, it's a long way from Los Angeles or New York or Baltimore. But because of the ease of transit from the Middle West to the cities of Philadelphia and New York, where the population base was, the Erie Canal and the development of the canal was an enormous boom to the city of Buffalo. In fact, as one of the things I mentioned in the article, when John Hazel was nominated to the federal district court bench, the admiralty lawyers in Chicago were opposed to having him join the bench because he didn't know anything about admiralty law. I would challenge anybody on this podcast from Buffalo or elsewhere, tell me the last time that there was an admiralty lawyer in Buffalo, New York. I know we're probably going to get a response that says, oh, I'm an admiralty lawyer. But the point was, Buffalo used its position on the eastern edge of Lake Erie. And they hadn't built the Welland Canal, so there was no transit down the St. Lawrence Seaway. The traffic stopped in Buffalo, and that was the major port for the iron ore and the minerals from Minnesota and Michigan, and all the farm products all went through Buffalo. So this is a time in which Buffalo is booming as a city, and Western New York, because of its farmlands, suddenly develops this new environment. The other thing that happens, and this is pertinent to those who live in Rochester, New York, but in the late 1880s, around the time that Emma Goldman arrived in the United States, a little-known guy named George Eastman invented photographic paper and developed a camera that could process pictures. He led the industrialization of Rochester, New York, that changed from a mill town that had used the flour mills from the Genesee River into a booming industrial metropolis by the first or second decade of the 20th century. So this is a time of enormous change in America. And the two people who are the primary characters in my article really personify a part of that.
Yeah, and I think in part of this, I'll just add that in this sort of milieu of people moving in, we have Irish in Rochester, everywhere, but we have Irish in Buffalo, we have Germans in Rochester, we've got Irish and a mixture in Syracuse and Italians in Utica, all along that canal that you're talking about, which was derided as Clinton's ditch when DeWitt Clinton was pushing it. The payoff from that continues to shape upstate, I think, in a lot of ways. So that's a super important thing. But in there with the canal is also the flow of ideas, right? It's not just the flow of commerce, but what as history always shows us, ideas and change and new people, new contexts. In upstate New York, these cities, I mean, we knew we were hotbeds of abolition. This was right where Seneca Falls happened. So there's a lot of what we might even today look at as sort of what might seem more prosaic ideas that have sort of been accepted, right, as a dominant narrative. But it was really a place where there was a lot of radical politics, which is part of what's happening in your piece.
Well, and what's sort of fascinating, it's not in my piece, but as a background, I wrote another article for Judicial Notice 6 or 8 years ago, which was about the role of judges in the lead up to the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Rights for Women that Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton were a big part of. So Western New York has a very interesting confluence. It has the Second Great Revival awakening in the 1840s, what the burned out district, when religious revival takes over Western New York. That leads to the advent of an interesting piece of legislation that's passed in 1848, which was the Married Women's Property Rights Act. It gave women the right to control their own property. That's the act that precedes the Women's Rights Convention, and it begins to change the role of women in society. It begins to foster a new politics. You mentioned abolition. Frederick Douglass chooses Rochester as his home in 1847 and publishes the North Star from Rochester, which becomes the most influential abolitionist paper in America. And he becomes a leading advocate for change. So you roll these factors together, a boom in industrialization, a flood of new immigrants, new ideas politically, a religious revival, the foundation and the pushing of the abolition movement. And all of this means that Western New York becomes a cauldron in which social change and cultural change is occurring at a rapid rate, faster than a generation turnover. It's just happening literally at light speed.
And we could add the spiritual movements, the birth of Mormonism. I mean, there's just no shortage of just things happening in this time period, which is so rich. And I'm going to have you back for another podcast about that previous piece some other time, because there's a lot of material to dig into there. But we've set the stage now. So we've referenced a couple of our main characters today. Can you tell us a little more about John Hazel and about Emma Goldman?
Sure. Let me start with John Hazel. John Hazel was a lawyer from Buffalo. He got involved in politics relatively early on, but he became really the Buffalo Republican boss in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And there are a couple things to realize. One is he controlled the election of judges. These were largely non-competitive races because Democrats in Buffalo weren't able to offer good candidates. If he selected a candidate to be a Supreme Court judge, they were going to win. So he used his leverage in the judiciary to strengthen the Republican Party in Buffalo. The other thing that you have to remember about this period of time in the 1890s is that this was the era in which United States senators were not elected by direct vote. They were elected by a vote of the state legislature. And that meant that the Republican boss in Buffalo, when the legislature was controlled by Republicans, he had enormous influence because New York City was run by the Democrats in Tammany Hall. Upstate New York and Long Island were run by Republicans, but Buffalo was the center of upstate New York Republican control. John Hazel was the Republican Party chair, and he had a big role in making sure that a man named Chauncey Depew became the United States Senator from New York. Thomas Platt, who became known as Boss Platt in the Republican Party, he also was beholden to Hazel because Hazel had votes in the state legislature to confirm their election. So
Yeah.
Hazel accumulates all this power. And while he's doing that in the late 1890s, a young Irish immigrant woman named Emma Goldman arrives in Rochester, New York. She's a seamstress. She's Russian. She arrives in Rochester, New York, and she marries a guy named Kirshner. And what's interesting about this, Eric, is I really got hooked on Emma Goldman when I did a bunch of work trying to figure out how she got divorced. I learned a lot about a Jewish divorce. I learned about a ketubah, which is the document that is exchanged with a Jewish couple when they're married. And you have to go to what's called a bet din, which is the Jewish tribunal, which can divorce a married couple. And I thought it was just fascinating that I did all this research on her. This is for an article I wrote for a local paper a long time ago, more than 10 years ago. But I was just fascinated by this young Russian immigrant who comes, learns English, goes to work as a seamstress. She has a daring move when she goes in and asks her boss. I didn't write about this, but she goes in and asks her boss for a raise, and the boss says, no raise. She storms out. She picks up her sewing machine, and she heads to New York City, leaving her husband high and dry. She eventually comes back, and after her divorce has been finalized, and marries him a second time, marries this man named Kirshner a second time. Second marriage doesn't work any better than the first. She goes to New York City, and during the course of the 1890s becomes the leading advocate for socialism and, importantly, anarchy in the United States. The interesting thing about the concept of anarchy is that it was really more of a socialist anarchy. It was not about revolution. It was about democratic revolution. It was about socialism. It was not pick up your gun and go out and shoot somebody. It was really about social change. So what's fascinating, you have John Hazel in Buffalo working hard to elect Republicans, and you have Emma Goldman, Rochester's foster daughter in New York City, shaking the foundations of New York City and the nation and talking about social change and political change and a recognition for workers. So you have these two disparate people in very different places pursuing very different ends. And that's really how the story starts.
Yeah. And I mean, my impression from your piece is, and I think a lot of folks will be familiar with Emma Goldman from her later life, her career as an advocate, involvement with Haymarket, and sort of the free love anarchist that we all hear about. But you sort of, I got the impression from your piece that her experiences as a young immigrant coming to join her sister and then struggling with that experience, with the low pay and the request for a raise and the firing, that's sort of her origin story, really. Like that's where she encountered what a socialist might talk about, the material circumstances of capitalism, as she, had such an antipathy towards.
Well, and I think part of it is, and this is something, again, that I learned, that the Jewish immigrant experience in Rochester, New York, in the last decade and a half of the 19th century was unpleasant in the extreme. These were individuals who couldn't speak English. They lived in small ghettos up in the northern part of the city. They were exploited by the textile and seamstress clothing manufacturers that were prominent in Rochester at the time. And they were smaller communities. Just to give you an example, I was unaware of the antipathy between German Jewish immigrants and Russian Jewish immigrants. And it was just a fascinating thing. She was discriminated against by German Jews because she spoke Russian. And so her immigrant experience, for trying to work for less than minimum, for a tiny wage, and then being forced into a marriage with someone that she wasn't particularly interested in, largely for economic survival and to get out of her mother and father's house, which was not an unusual immigrant experience in those days. Right. So you had that her socialism and her advocacy is built on her own life experience in that period of time when she came. She had difficulty setting in. She was forced into tough choices. She goes to New York City and works for a pittance, and then experiences the underbelly of capitalism and becomes a fierce advocate against it.
Yeah. And so that gives us a sense of who they are. How, and your piece goes into far more detail on the history here, and you can go into as much as you'd like here as well. But how do these two people, how do their courses, which would not normally interact at all, how do they end up kind of encountering each other?
It's a collision. And what happens is Emma Goldman, in the latter part of in 1898 to 1901, becomes an internationally renowned speaker on anarchy. And she gives speeches to immigrant groups and worker groups all over the country. She's advocating for unions and collective bargaining and bans on child labor. You mentioned her view about marriage and free love, free sex, not having any personal responsibilities in that regard. I'll explain those before we finish.
Yeah.
But she is giving speeches everywhere, and she's in Chicago, and she's giving a speech, and she talks about the importance of anarchy and about we have to bring down the capitalist society, and we've got to be prepared to fight for our rights, and we've got to be able to convince people that change is needed. And in the crowd is a Polish immigrant, and he hears Emma Goldman speak. He goes up to talk to her afterwards. She's surrounded by a crowd of people. It's not clear, but it appears as though he shakes her hand and says to her, "I heard you, I know what I've got to do," and he walks away. She has no recollection of him. Mm-hmm. His name is Kolzig. He gets on a train, buys a gun, finds out that William McKinley, the President of the United States, is going to be at the Pan American exhibition in Buffalo, New York. He goes to the Pan American exhibition. He's got a handkerchief. He has a gun pistol in his coat. He's walking up the reception line. At that point, there weren't lots of guards against the President of the United States. He's standing in a reception line. When the President goes to shake his hand, Kolzig pulls out a gun and shoots him in the chest. The President stumbles down. People jump all over Kolzig, and he's arrested. He's charged with an assassination attempt. McKinley is taken to healthcare people in Buffalo, and it appears McKinley may survive. But nonetheless, they take Kolzig into custody, and they say to him, "Why did you do this?" And he says, "Well, I was in a speech that Emma Goldman gave, and she told me that we needed to bring down capitalism, and this is what I'm going to do. I did it because Emma Goldman said I should do it." That leads to a manhunt across the country trying to find this Emma Goldman. She, of course, was a well-established figure, hard to hide. They find out she's hiding in a closet. The feds show up at their door. They say, "Are you Emma Goldman?" She tries to give them the old fake out. Says, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not." But after a couple questions, she breaks down and says, "Yes, she is." She's taken into custody. In the meantime, McKinley is hanging on. And it appears, actually, that McKinley might survive the shooting. But, as always, back in those days, sepsis gets in. The infection from the wound causes McKinley's death. This is after John Hazel had been appointed by William McKinley to be the first United States District Court judge in Western New York. And I just mentioned as sort of a footnote to that, that was not without a huge controversy. Because the Buffalo judges supported him. The Rochester Bar Association was not willing to approve his nomination. The New York City Bar Association, which was the most powerful in the country, said, "Don't approve him." The New York Times came out against him. The newspapers came out against him. And it looked like Hazel wasn't going to win, except, of course, he was appointed subject to Senate confirmation. Who were the two senators that were going to approve his confirmation? The two men who owed John Hazel the job. So with his approval in 1900, after they'd created the new Western District of New York, John Hazel is appointed, and he sits in May, I believe, of 1900 as the new judge in the Western District of New York. when Emma Goldman is captured, John Hazel is the district court judge.
Yep.
He assumes, since you were involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the president, that it's a federal crime and that Emma Goldman can be tried in front of his court for the assassination, the attempted assassination at that time, of William McKinley. Sure enough, McKinley dies. And then what happens? If you read the Morrison biography of TR, of Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's up in the Adirondacks, walking around the Adirondacks, and somebody runs up to him. He's the vice president of the United States.
Right.
Thomas Platt, the boss of New York, had engineered him out of the governor's face into the vice presidency, which is another little interesting political twist in New York. But anyway, Roosevelt's wandering around the Adirondacks when someone walks in and said, the president's been shot, he may die, you got to go to Buffalo. And what actually happens is McKinley dies in Buffalo, and Roosevelt shows up at the Ainsley House in Buffalo, and John Hazel, the United States District Court judge, administers the oath of office to Theodore Roosevelt become the president of the United States. So what's happening here is Hazel is the district court judge. He's swearing in the president. But what he really wants to do is go get Emma Goldman, the anarchist who told this guy to go shoot the president. It turns out that they interview Emma Goldman extensively. She says, I have no idea who this guy was. I don't remember all the people who come to my speeches. Kolzig, when he's imprisoned after a trial that occurred, I believe, 3 weeks after the shooting, a jury of 12 people deliberated for 20 minutes and found that he should be subject to the death penalty. But Kolzig tells federal officials and local law enforcement that although he heard Emma Goldman talk about it, she never told him to do it. And she did not inspire him to do it. There's nothing that she specifically said. Under those circumstances, both the state and the federal law enforcement conclude that Emma Goldman cannot be held responsible for the assassination of McKinley. And that's the piece that brings them together the first time, with Hazel desperately wanting to put Goldman on trial and being told that he can't do it because there's no evidence that she actually conspired with Kolzig to shoot.
And do we know, just as not quite one aside I'll make just as a host privilege, I always, and as I'm doing these interviews, this is a small world of these kind of elite folks, particularly at this time. It's a very small patrician world, you've called it. At the McKinley assassination, just for context for the listener, Robert Todd Lincoln was there. That was his third assassination of a president that he had encountered. So he was in public service at that time, as 50 years after his father had been assassinated. But it's just a very small world, and so it impacts a lot of folks.
Well, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it was a very small world, but it was dominated by Republican politics. In the wake of the Civil War, the Republican Party had used the Grand Army of the Republic, which were all the Civil War veterans. They gave pension benefits to members of the Union Army. The Republican Party was really fully entrenched in American politics, and just about everyone of political influence or political interest, forget influence, just interest, was a Republican. And McKinley came right out of that as the former governor of Ohio, right next door to New York, or not far away from it. And again, I think you can't emphasize enough, Eric, Buffalo was a huge deal. It was really the Midwest metropolis at the eastern end of the Great Lakes, and a huge trading center. And that's where Hazel's power arose.
And do we know, as a second question, do we know just in general, why did Hazel focus so, and we'll get into the next phase of their kind of collision, because he eventually got his goal to get Emma Goldman somehow, to spoil it. But do we know, why was he so fixated? Do we have any sense of that?
Well, it's very interesting. He actually knew McKinley personally. because he'd been at the 1896 and the 1900 conventions, had been a delegate. He knew certainly Platt and Depew, who were the senators. He was very close to Theodore Roosevelt. When Roosevelt was nominated to be governor of the state of New York in 1898, Roosevelt plays a role in this, and I'll explain that in a real brief sort of little piece off to the side.
Please,
but
please.
What happened was Roosevelt in 1898, just before the start of the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And when the war started, the Navy immediately needed ships to patrol the eastern coast because there was fear that a Spanish armada would be coming up the coast. So Roosevelt, as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he jumps in and he starts buying these luxury yachts. And sure enough, one of the luxury yachts he's buying is owned by a man named O'Connor. And these are
Gilded Age yachts. These are Gilded Age yachts we're talking about.
These are Gilded Age yachts. And interesting enough, they're steam yachts. Steam yachts. I actually wrote an article at one point about steam yachts in their heyday, so I happen to know a lot about steam yachts. But they were sea ready. They could go into the ocean. And the other thing about a steam engine yacht is they were very quiet. So they were looking for potentially Spanish ships that they needed immediate coverage, because the Navy had big ships, but not a lot of small ones. Anyway, Roosevelt agrees as Assistant Secretary. They would buy a whole bunch of these ships, and one of the ships he buys from a guy named O'Connor, and John Hazel, before he becomes the district court judge, is the broker for the deal. And the deal gets very smelly because a couple things happen. One is the purchase price that the government pays for the boat is $80,000. It's appraised after the end of the war, literally like 6 months later, it's appraised for $20,000. Everybody wonders why they paid more than that. And then there's a conflict between the descriptions of a former congressman from Buffalo and Hazel about how much the owner actually got. There's a suggestion that Hazel took more than a $5,000 commission. It becomes the subject of an extended discourse in the newspapers at the time he's nominated, but it appears as though Theodore Roosevelt might have had a little role in the hijinks of paying more than the sticker price for the yacht that was owned by one of his political friends. And the other thing that's sort of interesting about it is Roosevelt makes a tiny entrance into this piece, but you can't ignore the fact that Hazel jumps on the Roosevelt bandwagon because Theodore Roosevelt leaves as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he becomes the leader of the Rough Riders. He's America's last cowboy. If you think about it, who's the last guy who rode a horse into battle charging up a hill? And his name is Theodore Roosevelt. He's larger than life, but he plays a role in this because his ability to cut a deal for his friend comes into play. And the other thing I just mentioned, when the First World War happens, his cousin, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, does the same thing. He goes out and buys all these yachts from wealthy people in the New York Yacht Club and pays a premium price to get them because he's got to get them fast. And so the Roosevelt cousins were both involved not only in the Navy, but perhaps doing some naval tricks for their good friends. Anyway, that's another little part of the story.
And you don't get much more patrician than the Roosevelts. Let's just note.
Not at all. Not at all. But that's the story of John Hazel's, and it goes back to the point you made, which is the world was smaller. We were just going through the stage when sort of patrician, old-fashioned America was becoming totally industrialized. The flood of immigrants, the flood of industrialization really began to make a huge change in the character and the people who lived in America. And this story is about that. The second episode that comes into play between John Hazel and Emma Goldman is really one that evolves in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. After Goldman is acquitted and not involved in the assassination of McKinley, she goes underground. She spends a couple of years quietly working as a nurse in New York City. She comes back into the movement and becomes an even bigger voice for socialism and anarchy. She can't help but look at the tenements in New York City and the flood of immigrants and the terrible abuses. She becomes the most effective advocate for that. And as a consequence, she makes lots of enemies, including the then President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who knows that she was connected to the assassination of his predecessor. Roosevelt concludes that she's way too dangerous to not have the Department of Justice investigate her, which they do. And what they do is in 1908, they go back and they figure out that when Emma Goldman got married to the gentleman named Kirshner in Rochester, New York, in the Jewish ceremony, Kirshner was an American citizen, but he had actually been naturalized an American citizen before he was age 18. And therefore, he was not entitled to claim American citizenship. And under the then applicable immigration laws, Emma Goldman lost her ability to claim American citizenship, which meant that if she left the country, the United States could deny her re-entry. And she had become a world-known speaker. So what happens is the federal government realizes that Goldman there's an argument that Goldman is not an American citizen. So what they do is they bring a proceeding in the federal district court in Buffalo, in which what they want to do is strip Kirshner of his claim to citizenship. Not Emma Goldman, Kirshner, her, quote, husband at the time. And it's very interesting. They can't find Kirshner. They have no idea where he is. So they publish a little tombstone ad in the newspaper in Rochester that says, if you are Jacob Kirshner, come to Buffalo because we're going to take away your citizenship. And sure enough, the judge who's presiding over the exercise to remove Kirshner's citizenship is none other than the Honorable John Hazel, the federal district court judge in the Western District of New York. Everybody involved knew that Kirshner was not the topic of the attempt to strip him of his citizenship. The goal was to strip Emma Goldman of hers.
And just
sure enough,
for a little bit of extra context here, just in this cast of characters in the small world, who's the person at the Department of Justice that was spearheading a lot of this and calling her the most dangerous woman in America?
The interesting thing is the whole process of deporting Emma Goldman is eventually run by a new young lawyer in the Department of Justice whose name was John Edgar Hoover.
It's just, you can't make that up.
But J. Edgar Hoover makes his early claim to fame by stripping Emma Goldman of her citizenship. That doesn't happen till almost 6 or 7 years after Hazel issues the decision stripping Kirshner of his citizenship. And what happens after that is Theodore Roosevelt had agreed that she was the most dangerous woman in America. Woodrow Wilson is elected president. He's very concerned about the anarchists, so he keeps a close eye on them. The United States is being flooded with immigrants, and so they pass a series of new laws that change immigration and make it more difficult to become a citizen in the United States. There's clearly a backlash against Jewish immigrants, a huge one. And so in the latter part of the mid of the 1915, 1916, what happens is Emma Goldman becomes a leading advocate for the United States to stay out of the First World War. Do not get involved. It's not our fight. Woodrow Wilson, in April of 1917, declares that the United States is going to go to war with Germany because of the unrestricted submarine warfare. And one of the other things he does is he signs a draft law, which immediately requires the drafting of young men. And he also signs a law as part of the Espionage Act that says if you oppose the draft, you're committing a crime. Emma Goldman is on the front lines of opposing the draft. And what's very interesting about it, how small the world is, Eric, one of the reasons why she's opposed to the draft is because her nephew, who lives in Rochester, New York, happens to be one of the world's leading violin prodigies. He's sponsored by George Eastman. He's competed in Europe. His name is David Hochstein. He is really going to become one of the world's best violin players. He is subject to the draft. He eventually becomes a part of the United States Army. Tragically, 3 weeks before the armistice in 1918, he's killed in France. But Emma Goldman was strongly against the draft because she knew it would affect her sister's family and her nephew. Anyway, Emma Goldman is arrested. She's tried. She's convicted. She's sentenced to prison. She comes out of prison, and J. Edgar Hoover and the feds grab her on the way out the door and say, "You're no longer an American citizen. You're guilty of a crime. We're going to deport you," which is what they do. They send her back to Russia. And it's very interesting. Goldman is not really upset with going back to Russia. She wants to get back and see what communism has brought to Russia. Who are these Bolsheviks? She goes back. She actually has a private audience with Vladimir Lenin in Moscow. She lives there about a year and a half, and she becomes absolutely convinced that they're not, whatever communism is, these guys aren't it. They're a bunch of thugs. And she decides to leave Russia. She leaves Russia. She spends several years roaming around Europe trying to find a place to live. She eventually ends up in England, where she marries a Scottish miner that she never met. They just get married. Why? Because she wants citizenship in the Commonwealth. And what's very interesting about Emma Goldman, she was a strong critic of marriage. She didn't like marriage, thought it was outrageous. But the whole time she articulated that, there was a reason why she never got married. And the reason is, although she was divorced from Kirchner the first time, she never divorced him the second time. She was still married the whole time. She ran around saying that marriage is a bad idea. But eventually she concludes that Kirchner is deceased. She gets married. She comes back and lives in Toronto. In the 1930s, she asks Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, for a visa so she can come home and visit her family in Rochester, which he grants. She eventually comes back to Rochester, gives a series of speeches there. And the most interesting part about it, when the article concludes, is that all of the patricians in Rochester went to hear her speak. They said they weren't frightened at all anymore. The New Deal had put in place labor relations, minimum wages, fair labor standards, a ban on child labor. All of the things that she had advocated for 30 years earlier were now a matter of law. She was no longer scary. She was just described as a little old lady with a big voice and gray hair.
And what happened to Hazel?
Hazel eventually serves in the district court. He actually, I think, turns up to be a pretty solid judge. There's actually a case subsequent to the Emma Goldman fracas in which he defended the First Amendment rights of publications. He was involved in a series of important patent cases involving both Eastman Kodak Company and involving the airplane industry. And I think pretty much everybody would agree that Judge Hazel in the first 3 decades of the 20th century did a pretty good job in the Western District of New York.
Did he ever get a chance to brush up on his admiralty law?
I don't know that. I don't know whether he ever got around to doing admiralty law. But, this is, as you can see from this story, while change was on its way, you run into these two characters from upstate New York who personify change and politics and the change in attitudes. John Hazel, who's elected as a hardcore Republican, ends up backing First Amendment rights, which was an unusual thing in the first 20 years of the 20th century. And so you see that the culture changes, the circumstance change, the people change. And this story is really about two of these players who had a role in these changes, but they were also swept along by change as well, Eric. there were so many things happening in so many different places that the world changed, America changed, Western New York changed, and these two people are part of that change. And what's also fascinating is that it was a smaller world. And Theodore Roosevelt knew John Hazel, who knew Emma Goldman, who knew the President of the United States, who knew Senator Platt and Senator Depew, who bounced back and forth from Washington to Albany to New York City to Buffalo. It's really a vignette of a country on the move, and these people played a big part in it.
Yep. So much for upstate as a backwater.
No. We were at the forefront.
Yeah.
We may be
so,
again.
So, and well, with Micron coming to the region and all those things, it's gonna be transformative. So for the listener, I mean, I can imagine you were drawn to the story because you're a Rochester boy, born and bred.
Right.
But how'd you find the story? What's your process like?
Well, it started with an interesting little coincidence. I spent 13 years doing nothing but matrimonial law. And I was fascinated by Emma Goldman because I found out in a discussion with a rabbi that she had been divorced. And so I went through, tried to find the records of either her marriage or her divorce. And I learned some interesting things about Jewish rabbis and what they do with their records. And you took them with them. The rabbi who was at the synagogue where she was married went to Baltimore and took all of his records, his marriage records with him. And then they just disappeared. I couldn't find them. But what also got involved in an article I wrote earlier about Emma Goldman, when her father died, Adam Goldman was a relatively wealthy man. And what he did is he left his estate to his three daughters, one of whom was Emma Goldman. So I went to the Monroe County surrogate and I said, do you happen to have the file from his estate? And he said, yeah, I went into some full file. I said, all I want is the acceptance of legacy signed by Emma Goldman because it's got to be her original signature. And sure enough, called me 2 days later and said, here's the piece of paper with her original signature on it. And that's what really got me hooked on Emma Goldman. And then I know District Court Judge David Larimer is a good friend of mine, and he told me about John Hazel, sort of a picture of John Hazel. And when you put them together, that's how it came about. But as I said, I wrote an earlier article for Judicial Notice. It was the right place to go. Judge Freeman had been very good to me last time, so I put the idea together. And again, David Goodwin and the people that put the art in the article, they make the article come alive, and I want to commend them for their work as well. It works graphically, and they did a great job of holding me to the story and at the same time pushing me to make sure that I had my citations were correct and my information was accurate. So it really comes out of my experience as a matrimonial lawyer who was interested in Emma Goldman's divorce.
That's great. And you're right, we have a tremendous team and we have tremendous authors as well. So we're really glad to be able to work with you all. Is there anything I haven't asked about that you wanted to leave the listener with?
Going back through this period of time, there's a reason why New York is known as the Empire State. In this period, after the American Civil War until the 1920s, until westward expansion gave rise to California and the far west, New York was the powerhouse of innovation. It was a technological powerhouse. It was a political powerhouse. Cleveland was the president. He was from New York. Roosevelt was the president. He was from New York. Chester Arthur was from New York. And it really, New York State deserves the title of the Empire State if you look at what happened during this post-war Civil War expansion. And it's just an interesting time to write about when the world was a smaller place and New York was a bigger part of it. So I'm proud to put that story forward.
Yep. Well, I want to thank you, Judge Dollinger, for joining us today. If readers would like to learn more about the Historical Society and read your piece from Judicial Notice, we invite them to visit our website. That's history.nycourts.gov. And I think that ever upward is a great note to end on. So thank you, Judge.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Eric, and Daniel, thank you very much as well.